now that the press is looking into Supreme Court corruption, the hits keep coming. The Senate is demanding a list from Harlan Crow of gifts that he has given to Supreme Court justices, specifically Clarence Thomas. But hey, might as well ask what else he's given to whoever else. So joining us now to talk about this constitutional crisis that we're entering into is California Representative Ro Khanna. Congressman Khanna, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
And so my sense of this is that there was a social contract that existed for maybe half a century where the public just basically let the Supreme Court do whatever it was doing behind the black robes and behind the kind of the mystique of the legitimacy of the court. And something has broken, and that now that people are starting to look, they're really disturbed by what they're finding. What are you hearing from your colleagues on Capitol Hill about how they're thinking through this controversy around the court?
Well, one, there's a shock that Supreme Court justices are allowed to do this. I mean, most colleagues on the Hill, whatever you think of them, you go out for lunch and you end up picking up the tab usually because you don't want to fill out all the paperwork of someone paying for the lunch. And it's mind-boggling to me that you don't have similar regulations for Supreme Court justices. You have them for the executive branch as well. And I think this has just blown open the fact that the Supreme Court justices have not had many standards. Now, my guess is, even though the Supreme Court has had some absolutely awful decisions, it hasn't just been a beacon for sort of democracy and liberalism, that probably, maybe, I'm thinking in the past, people weren't as venal and you didn't have the kind of egregiousness. And now you've got this egregious case, and I think it's really called into question why we don't have standards.
You know, it's been interesting from the perspective of someone on the right to watch a lot of these reports start snowballing. It does, I mean, whether or not it's coordinated, it feels coordinated. And that's not to say it's not fair. It's not to say that there aren't some attacks that, not attacks, but there aren't some criticisms or revelations. For instance, I would think about the private flight logs with Clarence Thomas and Harlan Crow that stand out to me as something that obviously should have been disclosed and rules should be tightened so that we know what's happening. But it seems to be, you know, it was left to like the Daily Wire to report that Sonia Sotomayor, for instance, was hearing a case about Penguin Random House, well, obviously being in contract with Penguin Random House. Do you have concerns, Congressman, about how this has been sort of piled on conservative justices by the American media, and then it seems that it's not as balanced when there comes to the media's concerns about justices on the left that may be running afoul of similar rules, but it just sort of tanks the credibility of conservative justices without also saying, well, hey, this is probably a broader problem.
There are two reasons that the Supreme Court has a crisis of confidence. One has to do with the fact that they're just out of touch with the facts of modern life, that you have people appointed 20, 30 years ago who are taking away women's rights to an abortion pill, who are taking away voting rights. And there is real anger in the country. And I would say not just among the left, but many Americans to say, what is the Supreme Court doing? And that's why I propose term limits. There's a separate issue about conflicts of interest and people getting gifts and presiding on cases where they may have financial interest. Sometimes those two things can get conflated. I agree with you that they should be separate. We should make sure that the ethics conduct has separate reform. At the same time, I believe we need term limits. And I believe that the real crisis of this court is that they're taking away basic liberties and rights. And that is wholly apart from even their financial conflicts.
And some of this to me feels like a symptom of our second Gilded Age, because if you go back and you think about the last Gilded Age and you read some of the Supreme Court corruption that was going on then, just gab-smocking, incredible stuff. Like Supreme Court justices, like literally on the payroll of railroads, writing into laws that benefited the railroads and busting the railroad unions. And so it feels like we're entering kind of a second territory like that. And the way that original corruption was eventually broken was political. You know, you had FDR come in and give them a political check, say, you know, we're going to expand the court if you keep, you know, this combination of corruption and moving against the will of the voters, and boom, that snapped them back into place, and he didn't have to do the court packing scheme. Is there the political will on the Democratic side to actually check them? Because when voters see somebody like Judiciary Chairman Dick Durbin say, "Well, this is up to the Chief Justice, and we hope that he handles this," I think there's a lack of confidence that there is that will to check them in the way that they need to be checked to get them back on track.
Yeah, I don't think it's up to the Chief Justice. I think Congress should pass a law for a ethics code of conduct. It's not a violation of separation of powers. If it's a violation of separation of powers, how can we pass laws requiring the president or the vice president to have financial disclosures? How can we pass laws about conflicts for the executive branch? Of course we can pass laws on the Supreme Court. And the real thing we need is term limits, 18 years, and then you're out. You don't. The Constitution says you have to be a judge for life, not that you have to be on the Supreme Court for life. But Ryan, and I know you're a student of history. I guess part of what happened, it seems to me, is that there was, after FDR, this move towards meritocracy, this idea that now people are going to go and take tests and get into schools based on their own merit. And, you know, a lot of these justices have gone to Ivy League schools. I went to an Ivy League school, and that somehow this is going to make the process cleaner. And what we're now realizing is sort of a deeper point about the underbelly of meritocracy, that it did not root out the corruption. It may have made it much less blatant, but there's still a lot of conflicts of interest, and people with capital still have extraordinary influence in our democracy.
Yeah, and that's one of the difficult parts of this is even if there were stringent disclosures implemented, and then I want to ask you about that in a second, billionaires are still going to have plenty of access to the people in the highest echelons of power. And that isn't to say we should just throw up our hands, of course. It's just a note that even if I'm looking at some of the things short of, as you say, Congressman, term limits, which I would oppose, but like even if you look at that stuff, it's like, gosh, there's just so much access no matter what. And that gets to Ryan's point about the second Gilded Age. But what likelihood do you think there is of like actual, real ethical reform being passed and implemented in the Supreme Court? Because there obviously is a need for it. When you look at some of the different things that we've learned in the last several weeks, how likely do you think that is to happen?
I believe we need to your first question, we need to make this not just ideological, and we need to make it broader, that there have to be some common sense reforms. You know, the way to get Congress to act is to say it's unfair that Supreme Court justices aren't getting treated like members of Congress, or why can't they be subject to some of the same restrictions? If you make it about the conservative judges, obviously Republicans get defensive. But here's where I will make a partisan point. I think many Republicans are just fine with the court because they've gotten what they wanted. They got the Roe versus Wade overturned. The court is by and large functioning on their ideological agenda. And so they're reluctant to do things to change the status quo that is working for them. And that's why I think it's going to be hard to get something passed with Republicans controlling the House of Representatives.
And just to quickly add a point to that, it's funny because if maybe this push had happened when Elena Kagan didn't recuse herself from the Obamacare case, Republicans might have thought differently about it. But because in this case, Republicans feel like they have control over and are happy with where the Supreme Court is, there's probably less political will. But
18 years seems good. Do 18 years as a Supreme Court, and then you can go be a circuit court judge.
Yeah,
that seems fair. Congressman, I also wanted to ask you about a letter that was led by Representative Veronica Escobar that was calling out the kind of broken policy around sanctions as it relates to both Venezuela and Cuba and connecting it to the migration crisis. But there was this famous viral clip that during the State of the Union where you had President Biden coming up to Menendez and you can hear him saying, Bob, we need to talk about Cuba. And you see Bob Menendez's face kind of fall. He's like, I do not want to talk about Cuba to the president because I think Senator Menendez, the Judiciary Chair, quite fine with the sanctions regime and the kind of embargo that we've got currently. But now that we're almost 6 months on from that, are you getting any sense that the administration is kind of rethinking its policy towards Cuba and Venezuela as we're seeing a flood of migrants come as a direct result of our own policies toward those countries?
Well, I appreciate Veronica Escobar's leadership on this, and I had joined the letter, and she obviously represents El Paso, so she's feeling the brunt of the challenge with migrants coming across. There are many parts to solving this, but one of the things that will make it better is if we don't have draconian sanctions that are creating economic conditions and hardships that are leading to people leaving. I mean, the Republicans often say, well, it's not just all people coming for asylum from political persecution. They're coming because of economic deep deprivation. Well, one of the reasons that there's deep economic deprivation is because overly punitive sanctions that haven't worked. Look, Maduro is terrible human rights violations, terrible civil rights violations. But our policy during the Trump administration and then others, where we said, well, we'll figure out a way to topple him, get someone else installed. None of that worked. And now we've got these crippling sanctions that aren't doing much to weaken him, haven't led to any of the regime change, because we usually aren't good at that, but are leading to more Venezuelans coming to our border. And I guess just common sense should mean we don't want to be aggravating the flow of refugees into this country, especially economic refugees. Even if we're turning them away, it's putting so much stress on our border patrol.
And again, quickly on that point, if you are coming from Cuba or Venezuela, you actually have almost certainly, whoever you are, a legitimate case for political asylum, not even just economic asylum.
According to us, if we're sanctioning your,
but not not for the Biden administration's shift on Cuba,
right.
Which I think is incredibly unfortunate. And I do think the sanctions point is entirely fair.
Yeah. And also, so yesterday, President Biden said that he was contemplating using the 14th Amendment to get out of this debt ceiling crisis. Would you support that approach, and how much support do you think there would be in the Democratic caucus for a 14th Amendment end run around this?
I do support it. I mean, basically, Congress has already authorized the payments, and we've told the executive branch they need to pay this, and now we're telling them don't pay it. I mean, we're contradicting ourselves, and the president has a 14th Amendment obligation to pay the debts that Congress has said he needs to pay. I can understand the hesitation, because I actually think if it goes to the courts, it'll be resolved in the president's favor once and for all. We would end this sort of gamesmanship of the debt ceiling. But I do think that it may temporarily spook the markets at a time that the economy is already fragile. So obviously it's not an ideal situation. And while I support it, I also understand why the president was desperately trying to avoid that situation so that we're not adding more uncertainty to the economy.
Well, hey, the Fed's trying to undermine the economy anyway, so he can help them out there. Congressman Khanna, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Always a pleasure.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.